Well, Rachel, it's really nice to have you back on the podcast. It's been, I think, a couple of years since I talked to you about your last book,
Yes, the
uh,
ayahuasca book.
the ayahuasca book, yeah,
Yeah.
which I think sent your life on a new trajectory.
Yes, yes. I'd been working on that trajectory for a while, but that book was really part of it. But that book did open connections to the underground elders.
Hmm. Yeah, which is the subject of your latest book, Swimming in the Sacred. Um, I was curious. I mean, people can go back and listen to that earlier episode, I think, where we talk a lot about your background and that journey that led you to write the first book. But just quickly, for people who don't know you and your work, could you give a little bit of your professional background?
Yes. The non-professional background is that I went right from undergraduate from college to Esalen Institute into their residential program in 1968. I was 21 years old. So that was a 6-month program where we worked with, there were 11 of us. We worked 50, 60 hours a week on ourselves. I mean, it sounds a little indulgent now, but it was a great experience of working with all the workshop and therapy leaders of the time in 1968. And then, of course, I remained at Esalen for a couple of years. And during that time, I had a chance to work with different psychedelics because there were plenty, let's just be honest, there were plenty of drugs around, Big Sur, in the late 60s, and they were good quality. And also we had sort of a psycho-spiritual approach. And so often we were, up on the ridge overlooking the ocean. I mean, we were in beautiful nature, but I had never done the protocol where you're with a guide and you've got music, in your earphones and eye shades and you're turned inward. So I actually hadn't done that till I started this book.
Hmm. Um, Before our conversation, I did a little Google search, just out of curiosity to kind of see where things were at, little temperature check. And so I punched in psychedelic therapy experts, and the top article that came up was entitled something like "Top Experts Talk About Psychedelic Therapy," and the four people in there were all pretty much the same demographic. They were all, I
Let
would
me
say,
guess. Let me just take a wild guess. They were
well,
all white men.
yeah, and
Yeah,
particularly
what a coincidence.
well-educated, upper middle class or wealthy, men of European descent, of a certain age, middle age and above. I mean, what's your take on this? What's going on here?
I think thanks for the setup. What I say is these women, my criteria for interviewing them is that they'd been working underground for at least 20 years. And many of them have been working underground for 30 to 40 years. And that means they're above 60 years old. The eldest of the elders is now about 90. And they continue to work underground. So they're silenced twice. They're silenced because of their gender, and then they're silenced because they're working illegally.
Hmm.
Now, one of the first things you learn as a researcher, because I have both a clinical and a research background, one of the first things you learn as a researcher when you're developing a questionnaire is to interview people who are experts in that area that you're wanting to study. And so when I did the ayahuasca research, which was published in 2012, so see, that predates the book. The book was published in 2017, but I have an article in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs from 2012. So I developed the questionnaire in like 2008, 2009, and I went to someone who was an elder, was a woman. And she, of course, appears in the Swimming in the Sacred book, over a decade later. But I asked her at that time, like a good researcher, what questions should I ask? I was interviewing people who had at least one ceremony with ayahuasca in North America. And she was very clear, one question, ask them if they have an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. And so I did. And I had 81 people in the study. 3/4 of them reported that they had an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. And I thought, this is what the academic teams have never asked, because they did not interview one of the women. And the women have, and another reason for just interviewing women is they have very subtle, intimate relationship with the plant teachers, with the plant spirits. They tend to have their own preferred medicine, but they have relationships with what I call unseen others. Could be ancestral spirits, spirit guides, and the plant teachers. And I felt that they had a more intuitive, intimate relationship. Because I had talked to some of the men who were working underground, and I felt that the women were qualitatively different. So I can give an example of how the Hopkins team missed the boat on an internet study that they did, because they didn't interview the elder women.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions I was going to ask you is like, what do we miss when we continually look to the same male, upper middle class, well-educated demographic for advice and guidance on anything, but in particular on working with plant medicines and psychedelics?
Well, Hopkins came out with a couple of articles that were the result of an internet survey study, and it was about entity encounters. And so they asked people who had used, a whole array of drugs, and they divided them by their drug of choice, whether it was acid or DMT or ayahuasca, psilocybin, what they had used. And the question was, did you encounter an entity? And, many of them did, but they didn't, because they had not interviewed any of the women elders working underground, who frankly know more about the medicines and the medicine experience than any of the scholars, any of the researchers. They did not ask, do you have an ongoing relationship with this entity? So they missed this sense of an ongoing healing relationship that I have written about in the ayahuasca book, that an ongoing relationship like this can help heal some of the attachment traumas that people suffer with. So they missed a whole therapeutic approach to what these medicines can do. And the ongoing relationship goes way beyond the ceremony or the journey. So people feel in communion with a plant teacher during meditation, during dreams, during moments when they turn to the unseen other for support and guidance. It's not related necessarily to a drug being inside of them. But here they did, an interesting survey on entities, but they didn't ask the key question.
Right. Yeah. That's the first question that comes to my mind if I hear, yes, I encountered an entity in this experience, is, okay, are you still in contact with that entity or spirit? What's the nature of that relationship? Like, what's it like for you in an ongoing basis?
Yes.
So what are some of the things that you learned?
You have experience.
Well, yeah, and maybe a different perspective, because I'm a kind of renegade psychologist. I work outside the system. My education was outside the system.
Right.
So
in the study, I asked them, how do you communicate? How are you connected? And they answered, in meditation, in dreams. I can just hear the voice at any time during the day. I can sort of dial up the connection. So it's very much, that crosses different states of consciousness, but that the fact that the person can call on this unseen entity. This is when I was 35, 40 years in private practice. And so, I had a phone with a message on it, leave, I'll get back to you soon. It was just the standard therapy message, call 911 if you're an emergency. And people would say, I didn't really need to talk to you. I just needed to hear your voice. So I would call up and listen to your message, which was 20 seconds. But that's the the need for an attachment. That's, when you see little toddlers on the playground and they toddle back to their mother, they're going back to a home base. They just need to sort of refuel. And so that's what my clients would sometimes just call me, and they wouldn't even leave a message. They just needed to hear my voice. And so that's how these people who'd had an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca, this is how they talked about it. I could call on her anytime. That's a wonderful attachment relationship.
Yeah, I mean the kind of attachment relationship that people could have with Jesus or the Buddha or another kind of a deity.
Yes.
That being fulfilled by what people perceive as a plant spirit.
Yes, exactly. And it's not that these people thought of ayahuasca as a god. It's a source of wisdom and support. And even, ayahuasca was not always just supportive. I mean, she was sometimes challenging, but people had a confidence that even when she was challenging, it was in their own best interests.
Something just occurred to me. I don't think that I've thought about before, but as you're talking about people having a relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca, I've never heard anyone say, every morning I do a meditation and I check in with MDMA or I check in with LSD. What's going on there?
Well, I sort of have that same prejudice because, I think, oh, well, a plant spirit, that makes sense. But one of the, I know someone who's working on a book on ketamine, the most chemical, and she's thinking of calling it listening to ketamine. So she
Picking
has
up on your book.
Yeah, exactly. But she feels she has a relationship with ketamine, and people talk about a relationship with MDMA, and then they say, well, it's a source, the chemicals come from the willow tree. So ultimately it goes back to a plant. And certainly LSD goes back to a plant too, but it seems a little far-fetched to me, but people report this.
Okay. So you've seen that people still have that kind of personal relationship, even if it's a kind of distilled chemical
Basically,
compound.
chemical, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, even though that doesn't ring for me, I don't resonate with that. People report it, and I trust their lived experience.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you kind of already alluded to the premise of the new book. You wanted to speak with women who were working as psychedelic providers, facilitators, therapists in the underground. What were some of the parameters that you had for the women that you interviewed? Like, what kind of qualifications were you looking for?
None other than the criteria of a 20-year experience. I had no
Okay.
other qualifications.
Well, that's an important one. I would
That was the
think.
key one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why that and no other qualifications?
Well, I wanted the experience.
Hmm.
And what I found is that they'd really been working decades longer, that these were really the elders, not just the experienced people. They were really the elders who had, some of them had trained with, the book, The Secret Chief, about Leo Zeff. This is
Hmm.
really worth reading. One of them had trained with him in the early 60s. So they sort of occupied a historical place in the story of psychedelics because they were trained they were trained in all different situations. What they had in common, though, is that they worked on themselves for many years. So they didn't just dive in and say, I'm ready to be a psychedelic therapist. And in fact, they're not therapists at all. They're really more like priestesses. They sit in the ceremony and they maintain a sacred space. So they're more like priestesses. And I had to pretty early on give up the concept of, oh, they're therapists, because they don't think like therapists at all. They really, they don't look for resolving issues or things like that. They look for transformation.
Hmm.
what are you doing in your life? Are you kind of living up to your calling? It's a big spiritual questions they're looking at. And if someone is just coming back for ceremony after ceremony, and they're not really changing their life and finding ways to make a contribution, then they will stop doing ceremonies with them. So they're very serious about saying, I want to see a real change.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone after a ceremony says, well, a lot of stuff came up about my father, I'd like to talk to you about it. I've always had a problem with him. This group of women would most likely refer that person to a therapist who knows the territory. So they work in conjunction with professionals, and they would not want to see that person in an ongoing way, which is what any therapist does, but that's not what they do.
Yeah, you tell an anecdote in the book. You're in the kitchen talking to one or two friends, and one of them is one of these ceremonialists. I don't, titles are difficult, but she quite strongly, you were talking as a therapist, and she quite strongly said something like, "We don't talk about our childhood here," or something like that, right?
Yeah, we're not interested in your childhood. And my experience of that was that she was up in my face and screaming at me. That did not happen, because I had a friend there, and after the woman who was trained as a shaman, after she left, I said to my friend, "Did she yell at me?" She said, "No, she never yelled at you." And that was my clear memory. She'd gotten nose to nose and yelled in my face, basically saying, let go of that therapy speak. And what she had done, what I figured out she had done, because she hadn't really yelled at me at all, but she did an energy intervention. So it was a shamanic intervention, and I felt the shock of it. And it worked. I really let go of thinking they were therapists. I thought, oh, transformation. Well, that's really different. And in the process of transformation, psychological childhood issues really do often disappear, fall away. It's a totally different process.
Yeah, I found that as well, that there's something, I mean, if it's not your focus is to find the causal relationship between what happened then and the problems you're experiencing now, if you're looking more toward expansion and transformation, then the events of the past become less significant, I've found. And so I think, kind of modern psychotherapy is really caught up in childhood trauma and that cause and effect kind of relationship. And I think that can be limiting in a lot of ways. In what I found, yeah.
Go ahead.
Go
What you found? No, go. Finish your thought.
Well, just speaking with indigenous healers, they didn't seem to be interested in that at all, and found that it actually people could get kind of caught up in that story. And so they would often discourage people from dwelling too much on what happened in the past.
And the indigenous healers, we know from ayahuasca, they're really interested in clearing and cleaning. And so it's a really different process. And I have a friend who happens to be a Jungian analyst. So, he's had a lifetime of therapy besides his analytical training. And he said, he's worked on his trauma with his father, but in an ayahuasca ceremony, it disappeared. It didn't just resolve, it disappeared. That's a qualitative difference. Now, having spent my life either sitting in therapy as a therapist or as a client, I'm not ready to throw it out. And I think, lots of times we really do need to work on the family history. And if we skip it, we're at risk for acting it out in some way, or falling or rising into inflation. I mean, we're really at risk for a couple of problems. But I think it's also limiting. I mean, it doesn't do everything. And the transformation psychedelic process really can shift the whole story.
Mhm.
in a way that we don't really understand. It's certainly not cause and effect. It
Yeah.
just shifts in a whole different way.
I like what Jung said, that it's not so much that we solve our problems, is that we outgrow them, um, by kind of adding to our capacity and our breadth of experience. Yeah,
Yes.
that's what psychedelics have done for me largely.
Yes, it's sort of like the psychic space gets bigger,
Mhm.
so that the the childhood history occupies a smaller space of it.
Yeah, yeah, that's my feeling as well.
Yeah.
Um, well, you mentioned that the women you spoke to would often refer people to therapists, but did they have any approach to like integration or kind of post-ceremony care?
Well, it's interesting. They would certainly meet with people and they might do a follow-up phone call, but that's about it.
Hmm.
They did not, they really didn't, they would mostly like debrief or talk to them. They really were not doing a therapeutic intervention in that way. You know, the research protocols, you get maybe 3 integration sessions, follow-up sessions, which is not very much. I mean, from a therapy point of view, that's not very much. And the women are even briefer. But I still have an attachment to the process of psychotherapy. And I think things come up in ceremony that are so rich and ripe and sort of, they're calling for the therapeutic process that I'm not ready to throw it out. And I don't buy, an ayahuasca ceremony is worth 10 years of psychotherapy. I don't buy that. And there was one young guy, well, I now call him young, but he was in his early 40s. And he said he used to believe that. And then he finally realized all his relationships were crashing and burning. So he finally decided I better go to therapy. And he said, well, this is doing things that the ceremonies didn't. So I think both sides are true, and that they are really maybe parallel processes in some way, but quite different processes, and that we need both. And I was with um, I was with Tony Bosis in New York just a week or so ago. We went out to dinner and we had an encounter with a guy who's working with psychedelics, doing a lot of work professionally, highly trained and personally. And after we left him, we both said to each other, you can be a jerk before psychedelics and you can be a jerk after psychedelics. And, let's get real. I mean, in the late 60s, we thought that the psychedelic, the mystical experiences were going to change the world. Well, my generation hasn't done all that well changing the world.
Mm.
Let's
Mhm.
face it, the 60s generation, we've made kind of a mess of things. And so the psychedelics, they don't transform everything. It's just not that easy.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And yeah, I think they can definitely be complementary processes. Like psychotherapy for me, when it's done in a particular way, I think it serves a need that's missing in our contemporary culture, like the ability to have deep and meaningful conversations where there's no fear of judgment. I think that allows the person to become more themselves. And unfortunately, oftentimes it's got to be in a professional relationship to get that. But I like to believe, I kind of have a fantasy that before it was professionalized, we did that for each other, you know?
Yes, and I think that still happens. It has to be real simpatico friendships.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, my friend and mentor, Tom Moore, has written a book called Soul Therapy that advocates for just that, how just regular people, friends, family can have therapeutic conversations with each other.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, when, okay, so you talk to women who are mostly older, who had, at least 20 years experience. Was there anything surprising that you learned in these conversations with them?
I think it wasn't surprising, but I was very impressed by how dedicated they are to their own inner work and processing. And as I mentioned, they did a lot of their work using psychedelics. They worked on themselves a lot. They had therapy. They did both. But they continue. So they're continuing to work on themselves. One woman had this phrase that I thought was really interesting. If something happened in her life, she would say, that's working on me. So it was like something would happen, or she would reset, and it would rest inside of her in a way that kept evolving. So their commitment to their ongoing psychological development is very real. And when I said to one of them, the licensed therapists have not necessarily ever been in therapy, she just could not believe it. She didn't know that was possible. I said, no, they can't enforce that as part of a graduate program. You can get licensed without ever having sat in a therapy session for yourself. And she just was horrified. So their commitment to their work on themselves continues. And then the other thing that had such a big impact on me is I found them to be like spiritual warriors. They had done every medicine at every dosage level. And I remember talking to one of the women and saying something like, well, they don't always have to be cowboy dosages. You can have a lower dose and still have a mystical experience. And she says, yes, I like the lower doses. You can bring back more information. But sometimes I just like to fly. And I thought, well, I would never say that. This is someone who's just has no fear and, will go anywhere. And that's a unique aspect of these women.
Yeah, like the therapist who has never done therapy would be kind of like a shaman who's never undergone an apprenticeship, right? Something like that.
Well, and how many of let's ask ourselves, how many of the so-called new psychedelic therapists have much experience with entheogens? Have they even had their own therapy? Some yes, some no. Have they apprenticed with anybody? Do they have an elder monitoring them in any way? If they choose to work underground, which is a big risk, because you're really risking your license, do they have colleagues? Do they have a medical person to talk to about an intense medical interview? Are they really doing a medical history? If they have a question about something that comes up, do they have any peer supervision? Do they have colleagues to bounce things off of? How much are they continuing to learn from more experienced people? I was very impressed with how the underground women do not work alone. I mean, they are connected to a network of other people who they can call and talk to. I mean, when I was in private practice, I knew exactly what psychologist friend to call when I had a question. He was a very good clinical insight person.
Like a supervisor.
He was more of a colleague, more of a peer consult, because he would ask me questions too. And these women have that in their lives. They can turn to colleagues.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a danger of getting too kind of isolated in your ideas and your practice, right? And I find it's really helpful to have, like you said, just those peer colleagues that you can bounce things off of, like I'm having difficulty with this client. We're having, something's going on. Can you help me see another perspective here? Like, what am I missing? That kind of thing.
That's right. Yeah.
Or like, could you suggest a different move that I haven't thought of yet? Something to help the therapy to progress. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Another thing I remember you mentioning in the book is that I don't know if it was all the women or a good portion of them were doing quite intensive intakes with the people that they worked with, which I was I mean, I'm all in favor of, but I was surprised because my experience on both sides, being a participant and also counseling a lot of people who have done underground ceremonies or therapy, I think that's quite rare, it seems to me.
I tell people, don't go to someone who does not take a complete medical history. And these ones, they were very interesting. They said, if you ask once, are you on any medications? People will lie because they want to do a journey, so they won't tell.
Yes.
So you have to ask a couple of different ways. What medicines have you ever used? What diagnoses have you ever been given? I mean, they're very comprehensive.
Hmm.
And they've worked with medical doctors, and they consult with them.
Right. So they know those kind of, I think they're called the SOAP questions. It's like an intake form standard. So they have an idea of what to ask for, what to look for.
Nobody mentioned that. They've developed questionnaires on their own.
Yeah. Did you find in your interviews that it was mostly like a medical history rather than psychological or
Well, it was
or
medical
biographical?
psychiatric. It was medical psychiatric.
Okay.
I spoke to one old friend of mine, and he's not in the psychedelic community, he comes from the meditation community. And he said he knew some of the psychiatrists in LA who were practicing in the 50s and 60s. And he said, I had an opportunity back then to do an LSD trip, but the psychiatrist asked me questions about my family. And this guy happened to have an uncle who was schizophrenic. And the psychiatrist said, well, I wouldn't take you on as a client because you have a closely connected relative with a psychiatric history. I've not heard that from anyone in these days. So back then, it's interesting that was a criteria.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the 50s, schizophrenia was kind of all the rage. It was like such a focus in the psychiatric world back then that I'm not sure if like that would disqualify someone from taking a psychedelic, is that an uncle had schizophrenia. I don't know.
I didn't think it was a close enough relative, but it was interesting that was part of the history.
Yeah.
And we didn't have, it was in the mid 50s that we began to have drugs that could contain schizophrenia behavior.
Well, not contain it, maybe suppress it, possibly, but also
absolutely suppress it.
Contain is a nice way of saying suppress. But also, interestingly, induce schizophrenia-like manifestations or symptoms, right? I mean, that was kind of how LSD started being used in psychiatry. It was like psychomimetic. Yeah, but there's that fixation on schizophrenia. I mean, it was just like the latest thing.
Well, we had no treatment for it. Nothing worked until they developed the meds that would suppress the symptoms. It's true.
Yeah, quiet the voices inside. There's been more recent studies, though, that show that everybody has voices in their head. It's a matter of diagnoses.
I mean, the book was based on that. Yeah, right. But there is a movement coming out of England, I think, called Inner Voices, or the Voices Network, and it was started by people themselves, not professionals, and it was in the direction of just accepting the voices rather than fighting them, and rather than having hearing voices be a diagnostic symptom. And so it's a little bit making friends with the voices.
I mean, what other choice do we have? Like, this was like R.D. Laing's whole innovation. The thing that made him a kind of a rebel outcast was he was very much about allowing the voices and befriending and giving them a voice through the person and taking them kind of seriously or engaging with them, right?
More than the voices. He didn't use meds at all, and he was figuring that the psychotic break would work itself out.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, he was drinking a lot, but
Yeah.
this is a complicated situation.
He's an eccentric person. I mean, it takes an eccentric to come up with like
Give that a
radical
shot.
ideas,
And it takes round the clock care. So it's very, very it takes a lot of care around a person.
Yeah, I mean, he started up kind of residential
Yes.
places where people could live with him and be on call 24 hours a day. Well, I still want to, I'm still interested in, you noticed a qualitative difference between the women that you interviewed who are working in the underground versus people working like above ground in the mainstream. Do you think that there is something inherent to male-female differences in terms of how we approach experiences like this, like experiences of the numinous, the psychedelic experience? And like a kind of a part two to that is go back to my little research that I did and who are we looking to as experts in the field? Like why are we still looking to the same demographics for advice and guidance? Is there something in the psychology of the culture that's still fixated on men as authority or something like that? Or is there something about women maybe not feeling the same urge to make a mark on the world by being so public and being a spokesperson and a public authority or something like that? Like I'm just wondering about that.
Well, when you look for the top psychedelic therapists, what I would ask, and I don't know for sure when this happened, but when did the graduate programs have as many women as men? So when did the PhD psychologists include women? I mean, I had no encouragement from the psychology department to apply to graduate school. And that's because I was a woman. I had straight A's in all the psychology classes. And then the same thing, it's even later for the psychiatrists, because medical schools are still very difficult for women, even though now I think there might even be more women than men, but the faculty is still mostly men. It's just beginning to change. So that's why when you ask for experts and they're established in their field, you're always going to get more men. It should be gradually changing in the next decade or two.
But do you think there's anything to this hypothesis of, that possibly it's something about, a male desire to be known, to make his mark on the world, that kind of thing? And because even in 5 years of doing this podcast, I found it more difficult to find women to speak to who have written a book, who want to speak publicly about a certain topic. I just get curious about that. Like, is it a thing in men that wants, they want to go out into the world, that kind of heroic consciousness?
Well, they don't spend 20 years, doing laundry and changing diapers.
Mm-hmm.
So women's careers are interrupted. I mean, I left a big research career when I had my daughter. NIH called me and said, "Where's your next proposal?" And I said, I'm going to stay home with a baby. And they practically hung up on me. She was born in 82. Because they had already invested $100,000 in me. NIH had given me $100,000 to do a study, which I did and I completed. And then I gave birth, and that was the end of that career. So men don't have that kind of career interruption.
Yeah.
And then it's very difficult to go back and pick up a career 10 years later when the kids are then adolescents, and who knows what they're doing. I mean, these are the bigger differences. The women are not supported and they're still interrupting their careers.
The women that you spoke to, though, are they underground by choice or because they didn't have the same opportunities? I mean, was there a desire in them to be
No, these were
life?
not academic. No, these were not
Yeah.
academic. Their jobs were in different arenas. They, their work with the entheogens was underground, and that's how they continued.
Mhm.
So, so it was outside the academic professional world.
Yeah. I think, just personally, I think it's really important that there is always an underground current happening, because I think it's the underground that often keeps really important things alive in the culture that, if brought into the mainstream, get, I don't know, suppressed or altered in such a way to
I
conform
understand.
and to be
But
acceptable.
one of the women said, even if these medicines become legal, I would continue to work underground because that's where the sacred container is. So I think that's the attitude that you're looking for there, and they do feel that way.
Hmm.
And traditionally, these medicines have been used. I mean, the mystery schools that Eleusis, people were sworn to secrecy about them. So there is a secret nighttime underground component to them. And I do think that's true. I think, what the psychedelic renaissance, we're being challenged really. How does our Western culture want to hold these medicines? In what ways? And I think there's going to be a whole sort of smorgasbord of ways that people will hold them. And some will be in medically controlled situations, and some will be underground, and then everything in between. And people will have to educate themselves about what sort of opportunity do they want to look for.
Yes, and that puts a lot of responsibility on the person seeking help or
Yes,
healing, right?
yes, it does. It does.
Yeah, which in other
So be
cultures
careful.
is yeah, which in other cultures is par for the course of being an adult. Taking risks, practicing discernment. But in our culture, though, there's so much emphasis on safety, or the kind of perception of safety, or the intention of safety. I think that's a real problem with something like a decriminalization movement that would allow the underground to keep flowing and prosper. Um, what do you think about that? The whole idea, of safety and ceremony and that kind of thing.
If you talk to anyone who's been around for 50 years or so in this community with psychedelics, everybody knows someone who was harmed, who had a bad trip and never recovered, so their whole life was changed. But these medicines are very safe, and that's a very small percentage, but there is a risk. I mean, I took a Tylenol this morning. There's a risk, with the Tylenol. But it's not that there's no risk at all. So even though they're safe, people do have bad experiences that take even years to recover from, or not at all. But the power of what Nixon did in closing everything down, that set up the perception of these are dangerous drugs, and the way they're scheduled as dangerous drugs, and that's not true.
Mhm.
But
Well,
it should never be done lightly. I've been hearing of a lot
mhm,
of people doing different journeys alone, even ayahuasca, home
mhm,
alone. And
mhm.
I'm just sort of horrified. I mean, my experience of ayahuasca is in ceremony with an indigenous shaman, someone trained by an indigenous shaman, and that the ceremony is as important as the drug, the medicine itself. But I'm hearing more and more people doing things alone. And I mean, it's against everything I've ever been taught or understood. But I think this is part of what's happening, and people will be working in many different ways with the medicines. And this is part of what our culture is challenged to begin to understand. How do we want to incorporate these medicines into the Western world?
Mhm. One of the reasons why I was excited to hear that you're coming up with this book that had this particular focus is that in this psychedelic renaissance, if that's what we want to call it, that's what it's kind of colloquially known as. I don't, I'm not a big fan of the term actually, but in this kind of resurgence of interest in psychedelics, one of the things that I've really been trying to advocate for is not to lose all of the collective knowledge that has been accrued over the past, not just the millennia of like indigenous use of psychedelics, but even in the past 50, 60 years of that underground movement, all of those people working diligently and hopefully with integrity, but learning a lot along the way that doesn't transfer well into a kind of a clinical situation. And I think a lot of what is actually healing about a ceremony, let's say with music and kind of ritual around it, a lot of that is part of the healing. And I think that gets lost. And so what I've been advocating for is like, let's learn from what's been happening in the underground and incorporate that into the therapies that are happening in the mainstream. I mean, what are your thoughts about that, about
Well,
that
that's
kind of the
exactly what
integration?
that's
Yeah.
exactly, this book is in some ways a historical document. And it's not at all a how-to. I didn't want to write a how-to, but I wanted to write about how these women came to be who they are. And it's really through their own work and their own apprenticeships. And you just briefly mentioned your apprenticeship with Thomas More.
Well, something like an apprenticeship, but not that close,
Not that close. An apprenticeship is at the elbow, sitting at the elbow.
Yeah.
It's very close.
Yeah.
But you studied with him. And that takes time and it takes years. And in our current situation, people don't want to spend that time. So it's a very different approach. So I think, I of course agree with you about learning from those who are more experienced, but I don't really see it happening very much.
Yeah, I mean, I see it in my imagination and my fantasy. I even
Well, live in your fantasy.
I even proposed some like scenarios of what that could look like. Like instead of going to a downtown clinic for a ketamine drip, maybe you just go an hour outside of the city to a more natural place and have like a weekend experience with other people, and you get some of the other good stuff like the nature connection, the people connection, the ritual and song and all of that. I think it's doable, and I think it could be incorporated into a kind of mainstream therapy. It doesn't seem far-fetched to me.
One of the women I interviewed was trained by a Shipipo shaman. One or two of them were trained by different shamans. After 6 years of working with him, he said to her, "You're ready to sing in ceremony," which is a very big deal because the singing is a big part of the treatment.
It's the thing, yeah, with the Shipibo.
The thing. She said, "No, I'm not ready." 6 years. "No, I'm not ready." So she sat next to him, as I say, at the elbow, and he would sing, and she would sing the same song like a nanosecond right behind him. So it was almost like she was singing along with him. And they could compare what they were seeing in the person's body and energy field and how it was changing because of the Icaros. After a year of that, she was ready to start singing. So it's, I love your idea, what I call your fantasy of going out into nature and doing a ceremony, but who's going to run that ceremony? How many years have they studied to do that? So we don't have enough people who have gone through those kind of intensive studies and apprenticeships. Many of the women are taking on, are being mentors to younger people. And I know a handful of well-established therapists who are working very hard on themselves using the medicines and studying with different people who are elders. So there is a very small group moving in the same direction that these women did. Slightly different because they're therapists already, but they're spending the time. and they're working on themselves intensely.
Mm.
And that's really my message. You want to do this work on yourself intensely, do the work. And it was, Laura, I have a wonderful quote from Laura Huxley, who says, the most challenging aspect of guiding is to keep themselves out of their client's journey. So how do you do that?
Mhm.
Do your own work.
Yeah.
So, that's sort of my mantra. And that takes a lot of time.
Yeah. Takes a lot of self-knowledge and self-control, self-containment
And
to
real commitment.
not interfere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a big one. I was wondering, like, was there anything that you learned from them about what they think it takes to be a good guide?
Well,
Like
I've been thinking,
just like rules of thumb, anything like that?
no, it's not, it doesn't, people have asked me, well, what do they say during a ceremony? When they're guiding, when they're sitting, it's not about what you say. And this is what's very difficult to get across. It's who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not what you say, it's who you are. And these women, because they know the territory so well, they can kind of travel with the person and recognize where they are and what's going on because they've experienced it. So it's in their bones, it's in their own felt experience. It's a very somatic intuition.
Mm-hmm.
And that develops over time. And so it's who they are in their presence, sitting next to the person journeying. And so it's not about what they say. There's no quick way to do that. It's really comes out of who they are themselves and the work they've done on themselves. When they do research on what are the therapeutic variables that make psychotherapy effective, it usually comes back to the therapeutic alliance, how the therapist's capacity to relate to the client and to use that alliance in a therapeutic way. Well, that's very difficult to teach.
Yes.
It is just plain not taught in graduate school.
Well, because you can't put it into a program.
Right.
It's more about that person's personal journey in life and their practices.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And maybe their own experience with the therapist. And so it's developing that inner sense of presence that makes, that's the job of the guide. And that takes a long time to cook. I mean, that takes years of inner development to be able to sit there and to not be anxious and not be caught off guard and not to be afraid and not have your anxiety come up. Well, what's happening now? How are you feeling? It's also what not to do.
Yes. Right.
So, and also, one guy talked about an emergency where she had to take the person to the ER. Well, she's working underground. She's walking with the person, accompanying them into the ER. She was just lucky that it was a simpatico doctor because he figured out pretty quickly what was going on and he didn't report her. But to make that decision, to have the experience to know this is an emergency, we have to get help, and to be willing to risk themselves to go get that help. This comes over years and lots of experience and lots of guidance from elders.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really kind of challenging therapists who want to work in this arena to spend the time and do your own work.
Here. Yeah. I mean, in areas where there's less like the stakes are lower, like, so I think of in the classical Indian music tradition, say you're learning the drum, you're not allowed to touch the drum until you can sing all of the rhythms with your voice and make these hand gestures and all of that, and then you're allowed to touch the drum.
How long does that take?
It can take years. And there's no expectation that, come on, give me the drum. I want to start playing now. There's an acceptance that it takes time.
Right.
And that's the right way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised you chose an example from another culture. Our culture is not very good at this sort of ripening of the soul to be able
What
to
a
do
nice way to put
level
it.
work. We want it, we can jump right into this. And so our culture, has the problem with being patient like that and allowing for inner development to unfold.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that you're bringing that to light and advocating for it, making a case for it. I agree. Now, hesitant to say that there are any kind of rule of thumbs, but I could probably pick out a few in there, like do your work, have patience, take time,
Know,
apprenticeship, things.
know your medicine.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So one woman I sat with in the afternoon, and as we were finishing, it was a long interview conversation. This is someone I also knew well. She said, well, now I'm going to drink some ayahuasca. And I looked at her. I said, it's not a ceremony tonight. She said, no, the ceremony is tomorrow night, but this is a new batch and I need to know this medicine.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it's know the medicine.
Yeah. Well, something you said earlier about knowing the territory, that's an image that I work with quite a bit. And I make the analogy, like, would you go off on a wilderness journey with someone who had only read a map, who had never actually been on that land and knows it
That's
kind
a
of,
great one. Thank you. That's a great one.
there's no way you would. I mean, you'd be crazy to.
Yeah, well,
And I think the psyche is its own form of wilderness, whether we think of
yes,
the psyche or the astral realm or whatever, you're heading into unknown territory, or at least unknown to the acolyte. And
right.
so best to have a guide who can point out, the fruit on the tree that you can eat and the pitfalls to watch out for. That's what I see the role is like,
Yeah,
I
but
think you alluded to it, just like a field guide.
yeah, right. I know it makes perfect sense, but our culture doesn't really work like that. We
Yeah.
want immediate healing, curing, gratification. We're pretty demanding.
Yeah. And like James Hillman would say that, the kind of American psyche is really captured by a heroic fantasy, from the time of its inception. It's like heading out into uncharted territory and being the conqueror and planting your flag. And I
Right.
think we can have the same
That
approach
too.
to the psyche.
Yeah, right. And I talk about cowboy doses. That fits his description. Yeah,
Exactly.
the bigger the better. So, we have we have to decide as a culture different approaches to these medicines. We have to learn how to use them in our culture. And because they were illegal so long, we haven't done that in a conscious way. It's been going on underground, but we haven't really learned in a cultural way. And we're going to have to learn how to do that.
Hmm.
And it's
Yeah.
not looking too good.
Well, I wrote a little book on yoga and plant medicine a few years ago, and I did a little book tour. And so I was speaking to rooms full of people who were really interested in psychedelics and questions of integration and all of that. And they're really caught up in this idea of the psychedelic renaissance. It's happening again, and we can correct the mistakes that were made in the 60s and all of that. And I'm an etymologist. I really look at words for their deeper meaning. And so coming from Canada, I have a little bit of French. And so I see
Right.
renaissance, and immediately I think, well, it's rebirth. And if we think about culture is the environment in which something grows, that supports life in some way or limits life. My question was, if this is a rebirth, what kind of culture is it being born into? Because the culture surely shapes the growth. If we follow like a developmental model, it surely shapes the growth of the new organism. And so that to me is like where we have to get back to is like, what's going on in our culture. Because if we start to bring psychedelics into that culture and make them mainstream, make them a part of the culture, they're going to be shaped by all of the things that are going wrong in the culture itself. So there has to be like a deeper cultural shift, I think.
Was this an optimistic statement you started?
Well, it's an urge to kind of look deeper, not
Right.
just get caught up in the excitement of another new thing, another new trend in therapy or whatever, but to really like ask some hard questions about like what is the culture this is being born into, and then that gets into all the other questions that we were talking about, like why have women been suppressed in academia? Why aren't there more kind of female experts and authorities out there? Why does the culture continually look to the same male demographic for expertise? All those kind of questions, I think, need to be asked. If we're going to move forward in a kind of healthful, helpful way.
We have a long way to go.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I think so. There are two levels of challenges that I'm saying that, I'll be saying to audiences is that the culture has to find a way to work with these medicines. And we have to learn how to do that. We don't have a tradition like they do in Peru. We have to create a tradition, and there will be many different aspects. Some will be medical, some will be purely sacred ritual. There will be different, but that people have to know that there are different ways of working with the medicines and choose the way that speaks to them. That's a lot of public education. And right now, people have to work to get that education. It's not readily available. It's not wide known.
Right. They have to do a little digging for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So the other side of the question of like what kind of advice did they, might have offered to how to be a good guide or whatever. The other side of that is, were there any commonalities around the kind of things to watch out for, the pitfalls when either guiding or being a participant in underground ceremony?
Yeah. I go back to that medical history taking. If nobody does a complete medical history, don't do anything with them. So don't go to a group, don't go to a person. They only go to someone who takes a complete medical history. And you have every right to ask them, how long have you been working with this medicine? How experienced are you? Did you train with anybody? One of the elders said, you can ask, who authorized you to use this medicine? Now that's, and I thought, oh, that's kind of an aggressive question.
I like it though.
But
I have a fiery nature though.
It's a tough question.
It's a tough question. And I think, you might get the answer back, well, Mother Ayahuasca authorized me.
Yeah, well, and how many ceremonies have you been in?
Now, is that a red flag for you,
Yes.
Rachel? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I just want to be explicit about this. Like, what do you think with all of your experience? I've got you in front of me. I want to hear, all of this acquired wisdom that you carry too. Like, just to maybe to help some people listening who are engaged and maybe have questions around it, like just some kind of advice from an elder, someone who's been around the block a few times.
Yeah, I've been around the block. Yeah, it's very much asking, you want to know how experienced the person is. And if they say, well, I've been working with mushrooms for years and the mushrooms are teaching me, well, that's a little iffy. That means they've been working alone. Mm-hmm. And I'd be hesitant. I would prefer someone who said, well, I studied for years with someone who had trained, with someone, where there's some sense of lineage.
And I think for me, accountability, not just to a lineage, but to a community. I mean, that to me speaks a lot. If the person's embedded in a community and you see that, what's the health of that community around that person, that to
That's a
me
good
speaks
question.
volumes. Yeah.
That's a good question. I've
Like,
been
can I
asked.
speak, can I speak to other people that you've worked with? Right.
That's
Like
difficult. I don't know who would, that's a
the
difficult.
confidentiality, you
Yeah,
mean?
right,
Yeah.
right. But certainly, I always used to say to people looking for a therapist, if you have a friend who you see who's in therapy and they're doing better,
Yes.
find out who their therapist is.
Yeah.
Don't take a referral from your medical doctor. They don't know.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think that's great advice too. Just like look around, see who's doing well and go,
yeah,
hey, what are you doing? Is
yeah,
it the
exactly.
yoga? Is it the hot, is it the cold showers? Or
Right, right. Is it the swimming in the ocean? Yeah, yeah. But I like what you're saying about is the community healthy because uh inflation is a big risk in the
Mhm.
psychedelic community. And where there's inflation, there's usually ethical problems when
Yeah.
crossing of boundaries for a variety of reasons, sex for one, money, sex and money, but also free labor. You know,
Mhm.
you think you're apprenticing, but really what you're doing is they're gardening.
You're an
That's
indentured
not okay.
servant.
Yeah, exactly. So that's not a healthy community. So you want to watch out for any signs of inflation.
Mhm. Part of the kind of guard against inflation for me too is is there anyone around that person who they see as being on the same level? Like, are they alone at the top
Do
of the
they have any
pyramid?
fears? Yeah,
Yeah, with nobody to question them or call them out,
right.
or
That's a
that
good
to
one.
me, that's a big red flag. Is if it's kind of a sole practitioner and there's a clear hierarchy around them, and a bunch of
Yeah,
people who have invested interest in staying close to this person and staying involved. I mean, there's financial interest, there's
yes.
status issues. I mean, this is one of the things coming into this conversation. A question that was on my mind is, historically, when things go on in the underground, there are inevitably ethical issues happening, leaky boundaries, blurry boundaries. Uh, I see this all the time. Somebody is like a non-licensed therapist who is also doing mushroom circles on the weekend and maybe even supplying people with mushrooms or MDMA to take home with them. And to me, there's just, forget about the dual relationship. I mean, there's so much kind of entanglement there. And how, you know, did the women that you talk to see this as a problem of ethics, ethical boundaries, that kind of thing, dual relationships, all of that? Did they see that as a problem? And if so, how did they deal with that?
I think someone should see that as a problem. If this is an unlicensed person, there's no consequence.
Yeah.
So it's even more dangerous. Uh, and with the medicines, boundaries are naturally lowered. We are more susceptible. So I heard someone say, the indigenous women know never to be alone with a shaman. They never go in to see a shaman alone. They always have relatives with them. And it's for this very reason. So this is a pervasive issue. And it's not just women who are the victims. So there are plenty of examples of men who have been victimized as well. So I think you have to be very careful and have safety friends with, friends who will be there as your advocate.
Mhm. I'm thinking of something that's maybe a little more subtle than like overt sexual violation. Something like, so if I'm seeing someone who is acting as a counselor, there's that relationship. And if they're also the person leading the circles and maybe even supplying me with drugs on the side, I might have a vested interest to stay on as their counseling client, so I maintain my
To have
connection.
access, right?
Right. And then on the other side, the counselor, financially, they want to keep their clients, and they want to keep their customers. And so, I mean, it gets really, really tricky.
Yes, it is.
So the women that you talk to, I mean, did they talk about kind of, not, I guess, ethical boundaries, not professional boundaries, like when you're not accountable to a licensing board? What was their way of ensuring healthy boundaries so that, not only to do less harm or no harm or try to, reduce harm, but also to maintain mm, the health of their own private life, right?
Right. One story came up from one woman where she said, and this was, 40 years ago, so she was younger then, she was maybe, younger in the work, in her late 20s. And this was, 40 years ago, it was like in the 70s, I think, maybe 80s. But she served a medicine, she sat with someone, gave them a medicine that she herself had not experienced. And she was working in a community where she was reprimanded and not allowed to sit with anyone for a year. So she was punished.
Mm-hmm.
And she accepted that responsibility and that punishment. She broke the rule, never serve a medicine you don't know. And she broke that rule and she took the punishment. And it cost her a year of not being able to work. So that's a setting where there's a healthy enough community where people are held accountable. But that's pretty rare. Mm-hmm. And from a professional point of view, we're not supposed to have dual relationships. And that's what you're describing when you're talking about someone's acting as a therapist and a drug dealer and a ceremonial leader. I mean, it's a dual relation, it's a triply compromised relationship. And I would, I'm going to be interrupted.
Hi. Sorry.
Oh, I'm on a podcast. You're going to have to edit this. This is life on the island.
That screen door just swings open at any time.
Yeah, we just walk in each other's homes.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's nice. We help ourselves to the refrigerator. This is how it works here.
Hey, Rachel, I'm grabbing some sugar. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Great.
Yeah. So I lost track a little bit there.
Well, we were talking about, the dual or more than dual relationships. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think these are, I mean, you were asking what are the things to look for to take as warning signs, and this would be one of them.
Yeah. Well, not only that, like from the person seeking help side, but from the practitioners, because we want to, I mean, personally speaking, I want to maintain boundaries around my life, to not, so that my life doesn't get too messy, just for myself, so how did you hear from any of these women on how they practice that? They put that into practice, like maintaining healthy boundaries for their life?
One thing that was specific for the women, I think, is they would talk to each other a lot about self-care and not working too much so that they're, tired and overwhelmed, because there has been a great need for decades. And so the risk was that they would exhaust themselves and become depleted. So they were very good at supporting each other in their own self-care and learning how to set limits. And they would often do, retreats together where it was really, sort of like, for their own R&R, basically.
Right. Yeah. Let's let our hair down and not worry about holding space for anyone else. Let's just.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just share and catch up with each other. So there is a community. It's not that everybody knew everyone. I didn't just draw from one community, but that there is pretty much everyone knows someone. And so this issue of self-care comes up for women legitimately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we often lean on women to be the caregivers, and I mean, we see a disproportionate amount of women in the helping professions in general, and usually, like we were talking about earlier, it's usually on the front lines, maybe not so much in the upper echelons of academia, but really frontline caregivers. And
Right.
over the past 3 years, we've seen how hard it's been on them, trying to care for people under this kind of authoritarian rule. And man, so yeah, that's good to hear. So one of the boundaries you'd say is like knowing when to say no, not overworking themselves, and taking time for uh, not only self-care but kind of community care.
Yes, that they would talk to each other about that. And that's the opposite of one aspect of inflation, is that, I'm so needed. I have to do, I'm the only one who can help you. There's that
Hmm.
kind of inflation. So of course I have to work. And so I would really watch for different aspects of inflation.
Yeah, that's a biggie. Like, who was it that said early on that psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers? What wasn't mentioned in that, I think, is that it can also expand
Yes.
the ego, or
Yeah, yeah.
so
And
watch out.
and in the traditional um indigenous communities, they talk about humility, and that's kind of the antidote to inflation.
Yeah, humility. Yes, but how do we get to humility? Often through self-deprecation, through kind of like the trickster energy of, as soon as someone starts getting too puffed up, someone will come, like maybe an elder come along and say, "Hey, you're getting a little big for your britches here," or something.
Something.
And I think like that sense of humor is an integral part of healthy cultures. Particularly, it's something I've seen with indigenous people in Peru who are working with ayahuasca and other plant medicines. Always so much kind of laughing and giggling, even during ceremony.
A lot. There's a lot of joy. Yeah,
Yes.
we're a little low on joy, I think, in our in Western culture.
Well,
They're,
like
they're yeah, they're joy.
there's a definition of depression that was something like a malfunction of the mirth reflex.
That's good. That's very good. Well, what I know of the indigenous shaman who I know, they're very clear that they're not doing the healing, that it's that there's a source that comes through them that they open to, and it comes through them, but that it's the spirit doctors, the plants, the medicine is
Mhm.
doing the healing. So they their cosmology is not about themselves as a healer.
Well, that comes back to, where is this renaissance happening? It's happening in a very highly individualistic culture that is disconnected from its religious
Yeah.
traditions in a big way. So, you know, um, to
You can
say,
see where our culture is at risk for inflation.
yes, yes, it breeds inflation. Like we're all
Yes,
getting so pumped up. And then the kind of
literally.
the enantiodromia of it is a completely flattened depression.
Yeah.
And so we want to find that healthy ground where the tires are pumped up just enough so that you can get rolling, but not too
Get
pumped up
rolling.
so that they pop. Well, I'm a bicycle guy, so I always go to the bicycle
Yeah,
image.
right.
Okay, well, this has been really great, and I'm really grateful for you for kind of following me outside the kind of prescribed questions, and just really meeting me
Oh,
in
sure.
dialogue.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
It's refreshing for me. One thing I want to finish with is you've been doing, I'm sure, a bunch of like interviews and podcasts around the release of this book.
Yeah.
This happens to me sometimes, so it's coming from my experience. Is there anything that you've wanted to highlight or talk about in the book that no one's asked you about yet?
Oh, I do mean to say that the phrase "swimming in the sacred" comes from Maria Sabina, a Mexican curandera who
Mhm.
worked with the little saints, the magic mushrooms, and she would sing during the ceremony, and she would sing, "I am a woman who swims in the sacred."
Mm.
So there is this sense of an interpenetration of realities, and that the women elders have kind of a fluidity that that they can move gracefully between realms and in different worlds.
Yeah. Well, like the analogy of wanting an experienced wilderness guide who knows the lay of the land, knows all
Yeah.
the flora and fauna. Um, if you're going out into deep waters, you want to be with someone who can swim their ass off and
Good
maybe
idea.
knows how to give CPR or mouth to mouth.
There's some practical things.
Yes,
That's one of them. Yeah, for sure.
that's great.
Yeah.
So that's your response to my question. Like, is there anything that you want to bring that hasn't
Anything
been
else?
brought?
I think what I said before about how do we develop presence? I took notes on your interview. You just did the interview with Martin Shaw, and I don't know how I just found it. I don't know how long ago it was.
Yeah.
He talked about that we have a calling, that James Hillman's acorn theory.
Mhm.
I don't know if this is true for everybody, but it's certainly true for many of us, especially those of us working in this field. And how do we live up to our own calling? And the women elders, they're not looking for symptom reduction like the study team is. They don't think in terms of diagnosis and symptoms, but they're looking, well, what does the person do after the ceremony? And I think what they're looking at is, are they living up to their own inner calling? And that inner calling always leads to a contribution of some sort for the greater good. It's never an inner calling to make as much money as possible. That doesn't qualify as an inner calling. It always leads to a communal contribution of some sort. And I thought, and Martin Shaw just spoke so beautifully of this, so I can read it back to you. And I think the medicines help us in this process. He has, wonderful way of saying things, but I wrote it down.
The man's got a way with words. That's for
He's
sure.
got a way. Thank you. Way back in the dreaming of things. I mean, already that puts me in another realm. Way back in the dreaming of things, you had a contract to be something quite specific. But the moment you got here, the moment of birth, you fall into the milky amnesia, and you have to claw your way toward a kind of remembering. What are we here for? Is the spiritual question. What?
I would go one step further and say, what are we here to offer or to contribute?
Yeah. Yes.
Right? Because often that call can be mistaken as a kind of self-serving vocation in a way. And that's always an integral piece for me. Like, one way to look at the calling is not that it just comes from inside you, but the calling actually comes from outside of you.
Yes.
And it's calling you to fill some need in the world out there. Just like the bumblebee has its need, the tree has its need, everything else out there is filling what Bill Plotkin calls the ecological niche, its own particular ecological niche. There's something that everything has to contribute to the world. What is your ecological niche? How do you fit in? What do you have to contribute to the beautiful, rich tapestry of the world? Yes. And psychedelics can help us find that, but they can also enchant us with other ideas, right? The ego-inflated ideas.
Very enchanting. Yes, they're very enchanting. But this is, I think, the kind of outcome that the women elders are looking for. This quality of living up to your spiritual job.
I like that. The spiritual job, your obligation to the world. Come on. I love it.
Oh, good. Yes, that's what I call it.
I'm all for that too. I mean, I think that's something that just needs to be brought to the forefront more, that idea that we have an obligation to the world. It's not just my own purpose to achieve in life, but
Well, let
you have
me go a little further. Can I just, I
yes,
know
please.
sometimes you go over. So I looked you up on your website and you list all your credentials, all the trainings and workshops and things that you've done. And you've done a lot. And you've done more than most licensed therapists have done. You know that. So
I
you
don't know.
must have been driven to be searching for the best ways to live and work for yourself and also to help others, because you've got a long list.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's it. It was actually my community told me what they were looking for from me. I was just trying to teach people how to do yoga so that they felt better. They learned how to take care of themselves, that kind of thing. But what I found is when I started teaching people individually, we'd sit down, I'd want to talk to them about their yoga, and they'd start talking to me about their life
Their
and
life,
and their upbringing or the psychedelic journey they just had. And so that to me was the calling from outside. And so I said, okay, look, I need to know how to better meet this request and do it responsibly and gain some skills and knowledge. And so that sent me on the quest to learn about psychology and counseling and therapy and look at all the different approaches and try to find ones that were more in line with my values and my outlook on life. And I got to tell you, I love learning. And I think that's my kind of acorn, is like a curiosity about the world and like the big questions, like what makes us tick? What is our place in the grander scheme of things? Like that to me is what psychology is about, not about my anxiety about my boss or something. So I tend to go for like those deeper existential kind of questions, I suppose.
right.
And that's a never-ending journey. So I'm just hoping that I'm 80 and I'm still finding somebody who's like 95 and I go, okay, what have you learned?
And Martin Shaw used the term beautiful learning. But I think what you're describing is your own inner searching to fulfill your own calling. And that this is what the women elders look for in people. And there is a real inner drive, a real passion that comes from within.
I think, yeah, that's such a different orientation, I think, is to be like a nurturer of the acorn inside of each individual, rather than, something else. But that is like the deepest core, helping to nurture that. That just seems to me like an archetypally feminine capacity or role in the world, right? It's when we think of Mother Nature, it's like she's the one that makes all of this beauty grow. And so if women are embodying that spirit, they're going to help the beauty inside each of us to flourish and bloom and grow. I mean,
and it's not just feminine. You've prepared yourself to do it. So I think, when we talk about, well, what are these medicines for? They're to help us in this process. So in our conversation, it's not just about the drugs or even the entheogens. It's about this process of finding our calling and living up to it, and that the medicines help us do that. You just described your own process of being called by your community, and then that you rose to that occasion.
Well, every morning trying to rise to that.
And then there's that.
And like fighting off what James Hollis calls the gremlins of fear and lethargy. So you can get up and get
friends.
to work.
Yes. Right.
Oh, well, this has been great.
So you can get to work, so you can do the job you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Well, great note to end on. I hope that's inspiring to people. And I want to just notice that we didn't talk at all about the specificities of any particular psychedelic or medicine. Like what we're talking about is like, I think like the bigger picture, the bigger,
Yes.
yeah. And so I just find that interesting and refreshing that we didn't talk about brain chemistry and molecular makeup of different, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
These are the kind of discussions I like to have. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, enjoy the rest of the beautiful day out there on
Yeah.
the island in Maine, and I'll do the same here on my island,
Yes.
the coast of British Columbia. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.